So this is, as I say, sponsored by the History Department, by Africana Studies, by various other groups. My colleague Fiona Bernal, who has been the guide and orchestrator of this, will be talking about that more in a second. I'd just like to offer you a welcome, and I'd like to handle a few very appropriately called housekeeping matters here at the beginning. So first, I'd ask everyone, if it's appropriate, to silence your digital devices, your phones, for our conversation. Also, please note around you the nearest fire exit. There's one up here in the back where many people come in, and there's another over here. Just take a mental note of where it's the closest in the very rare event that you might need to use that. Second, importantly, we'd like to begin here at the Dodd Center, which, as you may know, is dedicated to questions of human rights and scholarly research. So it's appropriate to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the occupied territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We thank them for their strength and their resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And we will indeed be speaking about land and responsibilities today. I think this is a useful opportunity in having, hopefully you've gotten a chance already to look at the wonderful exhibit outside. I invite you to do so afterwards if not. This is a product of an enormous amount of hard work, of research, interviewing, and of synthesis, and storytelling, and creative interpretation on the part of our students, and on the part of the team led by Dr. Bernal. This is, I think, a really excellent opportunity to talk about the relevance, the value, and the purpose of history to understanding our present. How and why things are the way they are now. And thinking through especially these questions of land, of authority, of the kind of role of the state, of communities, and of housing is really a central dynamic in shaping those communities, in shaping their relationship to opportunity, in empowering and also in constraining those communities in ways that they have been thoroughly and thoughtfully documented in the exhibition, and that our speakers will be talking about tonight. This is I think the study and the evidence presented here gives a great example of a lot of powerful way into understanding how and why housing access and discrimination have led to the current patterns of residential segregation that we see in Connecticut, in Hartford, and many of America's major cities, and also in other places in Connecticut. And as we may get to talking about, how that is connected to education as well, because of the way that we have organized our educational system and its funding on a primary and secondary level. So these are really primal, crucial questions for us that connect to the struggles of communities and connect to some major public policy challenges of the present. And the role of history and the role of research, I think, is extremely valuable in understanding and confronting those challenges in our present. And products, investigations, deliverables like these exhibits provide one way for the field of history to share the findings of our research, to produce scholarship, produce in an accessible way that speaks to a larger public, that connects back to the broader communities that are affected by these processes that have been subjects in every sense of these histories, and to receive feedback. Everyone is an expert in their own life experiences, and blending these experiences with research, as has been wonderfully done here, is one avenue for us to promote shared historical authority. Now, at this point, I want to introduce my colleague Fiona Bernal, but I think she may soon be in the hallway.
I'm here.
She's here. Here she is. Okay, sorry, I was looking at the door, and here she comes. So, one word about the tremendous work that Fiona has done on this project and on other projects. This is, I don't know, depending on how we count it, sort of major public history project number 4 after a series of projects on child labor and human rights in South Africa, a project on struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and a very expansive project on West Indian migration, the West Indian community in Connecticut, that partly had as a subproduct this wonderful exhibition. So Fiona was trained as an Africanist historian, but she also has a great vocation as a public historian of immigrant communities, of major social and political issues of the day, and indeed a vocation as a public historian and a wonderful trainer and mentor of our students in developing these, as we just suggested, kind of new modes of historical analysis and a wide range of skills that can speak to a broader audience, and as I'm sure this discussion today is going to demonstrate, to issues of enormous contemporary relevance. So I want to thank her for her efforts in orchestrating all of this, and hand the mic over to her. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Renaud.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. April is National Housing Month, so I think, although it was a fluke that we were doing this at the end of the semester, it worked out perfectly that we should be talking about these very timely issues of housing access and discrimination in Hartford County during April. I am very grateful to my current chair, Mark Healy, and my previous chair, who in the last few years have given me the space to explore the intersection of public engagement and archival research and public history. And it definitely needs to be said, because most of the time the questions that we get asked is, when is your next book? And this this project is not a book. This project is a way for us to share our scholarly research with the public, but the public is not always going to read a book, and I think it's incumbent upon historians to take responsibility for those issues of access. The last time I published a book, it was $74. I'm not sure that the vast majority of the public can afford a $74 book. So I am so grateful that the members of the public, the members of UConn's academic community, have all come out to share this very different way of providing access to our scholarly research. I would like to first thank my team. I'm so short, I can't see some of you. As a major Research One university, I think it is very important that we provide these kinds of opportunities that you see the results of here to our undergraduate students. Everyone here at the university has an opportunity to engage in research. And as much as I would like to take credit for this exhibit by myself, this was a team effort. This was a collaborative effort. And so, as I call your name, if I can see you, I would like to ask you to stand, and for the audience to give you a round of applause for your absolutely phenomenal work today. So, Xavier Milling. We'll do one applause. Please remain standing, Xavier. Via Ruby. Center, El Instituto, and the Africana Studies Institute. There were a number of individuals at Hartford Public Library, including Jasmine Agosto and Martha Ray Nelson, who were indefatigable in their sort of enduring all of our questions when we descended on them, especially between Wednesdays and Fridays. And for administrative assistance, Ms. Nana Amos at the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, and Ms. Heather Parker, to whom I am very grateful for helping me to recruit this really wonderful team of students. So I would like us to thank our exhibition sponsors, please. In the interest of time, I have asked the team to distribute questions so that we can ask our panelists. Two of our panelists are running a bit tardy, so when they come, they will enter the stage, and we're hoping that it can be a bit more efficient if we collect the question cards. That is not to say if you have additional questions after the presentation that we won't have a question and answer period, but hopefully this will be more efficient. I would like to now turn our attention to our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. To my immediate right is Fernando Betancourt. Mr. Betancourt is best known for his position as the first appointed executive director for the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission of the Connecticut General Assembly in 1995. Mr. Betancourt was born in Puerto Rico, where he received a degree in law from the University of Puerto Rico. He came to Connecticut in 1987 and served as the deputy of the Human Resource Administration for the city. Mr. Betancourt has been a consummate advocate for social change since he arrived in the United States and since he arrived in Connecticut. He is currently the executive director of the San Juan Center in Hartford. Ms. Annette Sanderson has served as the executive director of the Hartford Housing Authority since 2012, prior to a short term as interim executive director. She's also taken roles in the Capital City Economic Development, serving as ED from 2005 to 2007, and as general counsel and assistant director between 1999 and 2005. She is currently the executive director of the Hartford Housing Authority, and in both of their capacities at both of the organizations at which they are currently the executive directors, I have asked for this following structure for our discussion. I have asked our panelists to give a very brief overview of the theme of the exhibition panels, and then I will be moderating discussion with them, and then we will turn to the audience for questions. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me now? Oh, no? Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation. It is indeed, Dr. Bernal, thank you for the invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. It's always fun when you're invited to talk about a topic that you're not an expert of. I love to see the audience response when they hear me. I would like to provide you just a synopsis of what the story of the San Juan Center is, because it's a microcosm of, in some ways, of the Puerto Rican migration to Hartford. But I also would like to invite you to see migration in a different way. For example, they talk about Puerto Ricans migrating from Puerto Rico to the United States. However, the reality is that it's not many differences from any other migration, from any other group in the history. The second element that I would like to invite you to look at this is that the history of mankind is the history of that migration. We would not be here having this conversation if more than 50,000 years ago, that migration started from other continents. In the case of African Americans, it's also important to understand that that was a forced migration through slavery. And in the case of West Indians, even though I'm not an expert on that subject, it has to do with the relationship, the colonial relationship with the British Empire. I mention that because when you talk about the percentages or statistics in this context, and you talk about the Puerto Rican coming to Puerto Rico, you will hear a number of different versions. But I would like to give you my own version of how I see that reality. Puerto Rico was, for more than 400 years, a colony of Spain. And the system that created the economic and social conditions in Puerto Rico was more a product of a system that is understood in economy as a mercantile. So almost everything was extracted from Puerto Rico for the benefit of the empire back then. With the arrival of the Americans in 1898, in the invasion of Puerto Rico, and I like to make sure that we understand, there was a war between the United States and Spain, and we had no say in that process. We were invaded, and so you understand the root of our migration. You have to understand part of that history of Puerto Rico. For instance, I know that there was migration here, including to Connecticut, by Puerto Ricans, even in the 19th century before the invasion of the Americas. As a matter of fact, there was, I believe his first name was Gustavo, I don't remember, a gentleman, Puerto Rican soldier that fought for the Union Army from Connecticut. However, you cannot talk about real migration from Puerto Rico to the United States until late in the 20th century. And the reason for that is that the first act of the United States over Puerto Rico was to change what it was considered a somewhat even impoverished, but somewhat diverse economy. And in 1898, the first act, remember, we had 400 years plus of civil government. The first act of the United States was to establish a military government that lasted for 2 years. All our civil laws were eliminated. Our currency not only was devalued, was changed completely. And if you look the period between the 1900s to 1940s, what was converted into a monocultural, agricultural-based economy in Puerto Rico did not improve the life of Puerto Ricans under the U.S. Sovereign administration. I mention that because if you look at the numbers coming from Puerto Rico, yes, there was several thousands coming, but they were not coming. And when you see in the exhibit that they always use this phrase, that Puerto Ricans were granted the U.S. citizenship in 1917 through the Jones Act, well, it was not a grant. It was an imposition. As a matter of fact, the only elected body representing Puerto Ricans wrote a letter unanimously rejecting the U.S. citizenship in 1917. However, you move forward, we're talking 2019, and the value in the psyche of an individual, of a Puerto Rican living in Puerto Rico, is completely different vis-a-vis the U.S. citizenship. I mention that because, like I said before, the history of mankind is the history of migration. And the value that you ascribe to that citizenship, regardless of what the context is, you might be living in Turkey, you might be living in Syria, in Spain, is vis-a-vis your value as a national entity, which is essence. Now, why the all of a sudden change in astronomical numbers in migration from Puerto Rico between 1948 all the way to the main 1970s? Well, the reality is that the economy was changed from an agricultural-based economy in Puerto Rico to an industrial base. And all of a sudden, if you don't understand this about Puerto Rico, you're about to learn it today. We are not a sovereign nation. We are a country. We are a nation. We have a nationality, a differentiated nationality. However, even though we are US citizens, we do not have any representation. In the last 121 years, not a single vote in Congress, not a single vote in the US Senate. For less than that, this country fought a war of independence. So you have to understand that Puerto Rico cannot have any commerce activity with any country in the world. We have no control over our ports, so migration is controlled by a federal law. So in that context, Puerto Rico all of a sudden became an industrialized country, and in the 1960s and 70s surpassed any other Latin American country in terms of income per capita. So many of the jobs that were needed in Puerto Rico, there was no jobs in Puerto Rico. So they came to the United States, particularly to areas like New York, New Jersey, particularly to plant tobacco, tomatoes, et cetera, et cetera. And remember when I say that we have so much in common with any other migrant? Look at the narrative and the discussion at the national level now, today. The issue is, oh, those undesirables, they are taking, the country's full, you know, and well, what happens if they don't come in droves and then pick up those jobs that others do not want to have? Well, that's exactly how people view Puerto Ricans back then, with the added inconvenience that we were not fluent in English because Spanish is our main language. So I want you to understand that that migration created an explosion, so to speak, in urban centers, one of which is Hartford. And Hartford is the city of its size of the largest concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the entire United States. You have more numbers in New York, Chicago, and many other places. However, in terms of the percentage, is Hartford. And we confronted, like any other preceding us, any other Italians, national group, Irish, you name it. We also suffered from discrimination. I remember when I moved in 1987, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, so my language is Spanish, my English is the second language. So my former wife, she had a master's degree, she was a counselor working at the university, and she was hired by the university school system in New Haven. And I was at the time working in a law firm in Puerto Rico, so we decided to come here in 1987, and we decided, well, let's ask for help. We want to move into New Haven, so we asked for a realtor. And guess what? The realtor was not African American, not Puerto Rican, not Latino, and a very good person. He brought us only to two neighborhoods in New Haven, the Hill section and the Fairhaven section, where Puerto Ricans were concentrated. And it just so happened that it was the most impoverished area of it there. So in his mind, he thought, well, let me do a favor, let me make a favor. This is not about income, education, or desire or ability to rent or buy any other, in other place. So I'm gonna just bring them where they will feel comfortable. So that's an example of indirect discrimination. So I'm gonna cut it here because I know you want to hear from others, but I would like to talk about the reality both local now in Hartford, the experience of the San Juan Center as we have prioritized housing and what we do vis-a-vis housing.
Yes. Hello. So my mic's on. So thank you for that. And I will kick it off with your theme of migration. So you had various groups coming to Hartford, coming to Connecticut, whether it be African Americans coming from the South, whether it be Puerto Ricans coming from Puerto Rico, can you hear me? Coming from Puerto Rico, or whether it be West Indians, there was an influx in the late 1930s and early 40s. There was an influx of people coming to this area, and these people needed housing. And I actually took a picture, if you'll allow me for a second, I actually took a picture. All of the exhibits caught my eye, but the one that really jumped off the page for me was the quote by the governor, Robert Hurley, he was governor between 1941 and 1943. He said, public housing is no longer an experiment. By that he meant people needed a place to live. People needed a place to live. So I'm a lawyer by background, so for those of you that have a legal background, I'm going to give you a little bit of history in terms of housing authorities. So housing authorities were created pursuant to a public act, and that public act is listed in Connecticut General Statutes 8-40. That statute basically gave local towns the authority to create public housing authorities. So my housing authority, the Hartford Housing Authority, was created by the city of Hartford, the mayor and the council in 1939, created the housing authority because they saw a need for an entity to basically create affordable housing opportunities. We were created, and our overall mission since 1939 has been to provide decent, safe, and affordable housing. The first two developments that were funded by HUD for the Hartford Housing Authority were Charter Oak, it's 1,000 units, and I see a display outside for that, and as well as Melton Court. And those developments were filled very quickly because people, wherever they were coming from, needed a place to live. Since that time, other developments were added. Stowe Village, the Stowe Village housing, public development. I actually spent my formative years in Stowe Village. When I was 3 weeks old, my parents moved into Stowe Village. I'm not going to tell you the year. You may be able to figure it out. That's okay. I'll share it with you at some point. But I spent the first 12 years of my life, actually 10 years of my life, in Stowe Village. So we had Stowe Village. There was, excuse me for that, Stowe Village, Bellevue Square, which is now referred to as Mary Shepherd Place. I see some heads nodding, some people who are familiar with Hartford. As I said, Charter Oak Terrace were our major developments. And then, as time went on, HUD also funded other developments, whether they be other scattered sites or whether they be developments that were specific for individuals with disabilities and elderly people. And those developments are Smith Towers, Betty Knox Apartments, Kent Apartments, and Mary Mahoney Village. So we have primarily relied on HUD, the federal government, to provide an ongoing operating subsidy for these developments. Now, we all know what's going on with the federal government, right? If you look back over the past decades, sometimes funding for public housing has been up, sometimes it's been at 100%, sometimes it's not been what we need it to be. I will tell you that there is not enough affordable housing in Hartford. There's not enough affordable housing in Connecticut. We have a list, just on our low-income public housing list, we have over 600 families waiting for public housing. These are people that have, in some instances, have been on the list for up to 2 years. At this point, because the list is so extensive, we are not accepting any applications. There's also another program that we run. It's known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where we have approximately 2,500 vouchers. Another name for that Housing Choice Voucher Program is called the Section 8 program. Many of you are familiar with that term. So I'm just going to give you an example. During my tenure, since 2012, we've opened that list twice. Okay, so back in 2014, August of 2014, we opened a list and we opened it for just over a week. We received over 20,000 applications for 700 spots, okay? And the last time we opened it was in November of this year. And so I said, let's keep it open for 4 days. And those 4 days, again, for approximately 700 spots, we received 13,000 applications. So that says a lot about the need for public housing. I could fill up up, if I had another, I will tell you what I have right now. I have just over 1,000 units of low-income public housing units. I also have another approximately 800 units that are going through redevelopment at this point. If I had another 5,000 units, I could fill it up. There's not enough decent, safe, and affordable housing. There's lots of affordable housing, but it's not, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, it's not of a quality where it should be. And I tell people, are we the best landlord in town? I would never say that. We're certainly not the worst. I think we do a very good job based on the funding that we get, the funding that we receive from HUD. It is my goal, my mission, to reposition my portfolio, to continue to redevelop my portfolio, to continue to look at areas where I could create more decent, safe, and affordable housing, because that's our mission. And it's a mission that's near and dear to me, as I said, because I come out of public housing. You know, I still have family that live in public housing. I still see, you know, the children of people that I grew up with that are now my clients, that come to me that are looking for a decent, safe, and affordable place to live. I'm on, my email is listed on some type of listserv or whatever. And so when I get up in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, I look at my work emails first thing, and I see emails from people that are desperate for housing. You know, and I'm not being dramatic here, but people saying, hello, good morning, Mrs. Sanderson. I'm sending you this email because I live in my car and me and my daughter, and I need a place to live. Are you accepting applications? And the hardest thing to do is to reply back and say, I can't even accept an application from you at this point because my wait list is full. And I know with the current length of my wait list, it's gonna take me at least 2 years to get through that. So I certainly applaud what you all have done in terms of highlighting this issue and the need, talking about the history of housing, because people that have come from areas, whether it be Puerto Rico, whether it be African Americans coming from the South, whether it be West Indians, did face discrimination and didn't have a place to go. Were not welcome in some of the suburbs. Were not welcome in certain parts of some of the urban centers. And they needed a place, an entity that was going to provide housing for them. And again, I wish I had more to do. I wish we could do more. So I could go on and on, but I'm gonna cut it off at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our final two panelists to introduce themselves and then spend about 2 minutes providing an overview of where your organization or your personal experiences fit into this whole cause.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pastor A.J. Johnson, and I'm the senior pastor of Urban Hope Refuge Church on the corner of Westland and Barber Street in Hartford's North End. And I am also the lead community organizer for the Christian Activities Council, where our mission is to help residents and help people find their voice and to create leaders in our community. I'm also a member of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated, which has a chapter here called the Heavenly Zeta Lambda Chapter. And I hope my younger line brothers are doing right. If not, please let me know so I can get on them. And so our perspective is a little different. As a community organizer and as someone who goes out into the community and listens to issues and creates action around those issues, our interaction with housing is a little different. We're not housing professionals, but when we community organize, we listen to the folks that are being affected, and we go through and we evaluate if it's a problem or it's an issue. And some of you should get some pen and paper out right now because this is about to get really good. And how we identify problems and issues. Problems are something that are vast, something that's big, that's unaccountable, that's winnable, that's sizable, and something that we can provide action on immediately. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Problems are big, vast, and something you cannot provide action around immediately. Okay, issues are something that are winnable, sizable, and accountable, and something that we can provide action around immediately. So it's kind of like going to, anybody go to a barbershop or a hair salon? Raise your hand if you go to a barbershop or hair salon. That's pretty awesome, great job. So how we evaluate it is like sitting in a barbershop and someone saying, or a hair salon, and someone saying, man, we really need to do something about these drugs. Okay, how? You know, where are the drugs? Who's sending the drug? You know, and listening to those conversations go around and round and round and round, and nothing ever really gets done. But what we do is we meet residents where they are, and we ask them, what keeps you up at night? And when we ask them that question, we also ask them, you know, what are some things you want for your children? And as we do this, we begin to go through the problems, and we begin to find issues, and then we begin to provide action around those issues. One of the issues that has come to us is an issue of housing. A young mom, I was doing organizing in Milner School in Hartford, Connecticut, and a parent came to me and said, Pastor AJ, you need to go to Albany Avenue. There's a mom there whose daughter who keeps getting bitten by mice. And, with rats, I apologize. And you really need to set an appointment and go over there. So as an organizer, you're used to people missing meetings, right? You're used to people just not showing up, just forgetting that they have a meeting with you. So I told this particular mom, I'm going to be there on this particular day. You be there on time. So I get to her house that day. I knock on the door, and guess what? She's not there. And so I call her, and I'm about to lean into her, because I'm like, I told you not to miss this appointment. This is very, very important. She said, Pastor AJ, in her broken English, she said, Pastor AJ, I'm at the hospital getting my daughter's stomach pumped because she ingested mice poison this morning. And so I immediately ran to St. Francis Hospital, and as she's coming out of the ER, I see 3 DCF workers with her trying to remove her 6 kids from her at that moment. I asked them to please give me a moment with her so we can talk. And she said, Pastor AJ, this is my first time meeting you, but you're not going to believe what I'm telling you because they don't believe what I'm about to tell you. I have 6 children, and I have a mice infestation in my apartment where mice are in my groceries, mice are in my children's bedrooms. They're just ridiculous. And I catch about 17 mice a day. And she goes on to say, the landlord only drops off sticky traps. And she said, I went out and I got rat poison to handle it for myself. And unfortunately, my daughter got up before I did and ingested this mice poison. And now DCF is trying to remove my children. I was so angry. I was so upset for her. And so I left that hospital and I looked up who the landlord was. And the landlord was a guy by the name of Emmanuel Koo, who actually owns properties out here in stores. That's just a side note for all the organizers and lawyers in the room, okay? And we found out he owned 26 buildings in that neighborhood. And not only just 26 buildings, but that's like 35% of the public housing stock in the Clay Arsenal neighborhood. And so we begin to knock on doors and we begin to see that there's a whole host of issues. So we begin to organize residents around issues that meant something to them. And housing was one major issue. And I remember going, and I'm about to cut it here, I remember going to a meeting with one of our resident leaders named Terry Morrison. And when I walked in the room, it was a letter sent out saying that the landlord is going to be here, bring your concerns to the landlord. And I walk into this room, and the landlord isn't there, but a property manager is there. And there was this young man in the room who was just so angry, but his anger was so cold, because there's a difference between hot anger and cold anger. Hot anger is when you snap your neck, roll your eyes, and cuss somebody out, right? And we try not to do that, although it may be fun. But we teach what cold anger is. Cold anger is strategic and very direct. And the young man sitting next to me is the person that I'm talking about. He was there, he lived with his mom, and he was just fed up and wanted to see the landlord. And then from that moment, I realized that we had a leader who was willing to step up and make change. And so long story short, the residents pushed to get the federal subsidy removed from the project, and now they have vouchers. And we can talk about how good vouchers are and how bad vouchers are. But I think our job is to go into communities and be a voice for those who are so often not listened to in project-based housing and in Section 8 housing. And so I'll end there, and that's my introduction. And this is Joshua.
Thank you, AJ. Hello, everybody. My name is Joshua Serrano. Me as well, I'm a community organizer with the Christian Activities Council, but my journey didn't just start there. As Pastor AJ said, I was a resident at Clay Arsenal Renaissance Apartments, also known as Clay Arsenal in the map. And like he said, I was living under my mother's roof, so being a person raised by morals, we were always taught never to go over what one mom says to a child. So my mother was one of those residents who was scared to speak up on behalf of her rights. First of all, thinking, the owner would retaliate and she'll end up homeless. And secondly, she didn't have a lot of faith in the system per se, right? So the meeting that Pastor AJ is referring to happened shortly after my mother moved out. I became head household and the fight was on. So I came to this meeting that AJ mentioned due to the fact that for the first time the owner was going to be there, and I would have an opportunity to not only meet the owner face to face, but also give him, my peace of mind face to face and talk about some of the concerns and conditions that we were enduring in the property. So we realized he wasn't there, and we realized that the property manager did not have the answers that we needed in order to resolve our situation. So, like AJ said, I was angry. Anybody in my predicament would be, but I had the knowledge enough to know that being mad and going out all ballistic wouldn't get me the result that I needed, not only for myself, but I am a parent, single co-parent of an amazing now 11-year-old boy. So I had to show him, because I really believe that learning starts at home, and what am I teaching my son if I'm teaching him to live under this type of oppression, So I did what any parent with the right mind and tool sets would do, is seek help. And Pastor AJ happened to be in this meeting, and right outside, right after the manager walked out of the meeting because she could not handle the heat and the pressure for these questions that we felt were legitimate, and she didn't have the resources at the time to make it meet, but that wasn't our problem per se. So she walked out, the meeting was adjourned, and we finished the meeting in the parking lot, and that's when I first heard of community organizer by Pastor AJ Johnson. And it was something new, because what we experienced for so many years was nobody really comes to our community to try to help us out. Yeah, they come and they try to profit, and politicians come when the time is right for votes, but nobody really comes when it's time for need, when it's time for change. So, at first I was like, well, what is the Christian Activities Council? And he gave me a quick layout, we're empowering residents to fight injustice in the greater Hartford. And, am I willing with their backup to take this fight head on? And I was like, of course. I was just waiting for some backup, let's do it. And it didn't happen overnight. It was a 1.5-year journey. But, like he said, Mrs. Tay Morrison, she was a great leader, one of my fellow leaders as well in this community. It was 26 buildings. It was what's called a scatter site. So this owner owns buildings in a 6-block radius, 150 units or so. And what we realized was that these conditions that not only myself over on Main Street was experiencing, and not only the families over at Albany were experiencing, but this was happening in all his buildings. So with the proper support and a proper guidance on how we go about getting information and how we go about identifying who our person of interest is, in other words, the target, doing a power analysis. Pretty sure some of you may know what that is, but if not, it's just basically we map out who has power in the city of Hartford and what does that power mean, and who is the best person to go talk to make change in our situation. So, that was pretty cool. It was new, like I said, we had a 1.5-year work. We did all the research, and it was exciting, not only for myself, but also to be able to show my son that the growth that I was enduring in this transition, and for him to see the difference in how my mother thought when she was oppressed by some of the strong terms and what she felt was somewhat of a threatening gesture from management, and sending false notices that if you knew your rights, they were bogus. But she was real skeptical, like I said, of the system at this time. And just to see my son see that aspect of things and see how she handles her situation, and then see the whole 360 of how I no longer want to ask, I want to demand what was mine. And when I say what was mine, we sign contracts, right? And a contract is a three-party contract. It is me, the resident, the property management with the owner, and then the federal Department of HUD. And all three parties have an obligation under this contract, and for some reason, the only obligation that was seen to be met was the fact that we had to pay our rent. But disregarding the fact that HUD is supposed to oversee this, and they're supposed to make sure that everything is working smoothly, and the fact that, they abated his contract shows that either they didn't do the best job at overseeing, or maybe they weren't overseeing at all, right? That's just up for speculation. And in this process, we realized that sometimes the people that we put our trust in and the system that we put our trust in is not always going to work for us, right? And then the way how the system is worked is always you got to speak to this person, or not, you speak to this person. And what I learned and I love about organizing, community organizing, is we bypass the system and we come face to face with the person or people or agency or entity who is there to make that change happen. And that's a whole different set of pressure there. So this is super exciting, and I don't want to take too much time. I am available for questions and sidebars, and I'll give anybody here a business card if that need be, just so we can talk a little bit more if you're interested. But it's just, I am a spitting image of how community organizing works. Not only do they go and find potential leaders, but they also develop the skills and the mindset and the knowledge needed to understand that sometimes it is not just this community's issue, it is systematic, and the sooner we realize that it is a systematic issue, the better we can join forces to combat it. Cool? And like I said, I'm available anytime after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So from the vantage point of the San Juan Center and the Hartford Housing Authority, and given the backlog in decent, safe, affordable housing, what actions can your organizations take to help address some of the issues that people are facing in Hartford around the Start with you.
Well, the San Juan Center has a comprehensive approach to this issue. For us, housing is a priority, but we need to also find jobs to individuals who come through our doors. We need to stabilize that community. In our case, you have to add that other layer of English as a second language, because many of the jobs that you have available will not allow you, you don't speak any English. So it's very, very complex. Now, our experience is, to give you an idea, if I have a vacancy for one of our properties, we own and manage 76 units of elderly housing, independent living. Now, we always have a waiting list, always. Second, we have 12 more units that are not elderly, and they're always full. However, we try to provide the best quality, because our position is that as a landlord, so to speak, as an owner, even though we are a non-profit organization, the individuals who live under the poverty line should be allowed to live with the same dignity and the same quality of life like any other individual. But I would like to transition to say that this is a systemic problem. When I was hearing the gentlemen at the end, let me give you an anecdote in Haiti. After the dictatorship, the first election, you can see hundreds in line waiting to go and vote. Well, there was this jeep with a machine gun, and it started spraying bullets all over. They ducked. And you know what they did after they left? They got up and stay in that line. What do I mean by that? If we are talking about politicians that don't visit our neighborhoods until they have, forget about the politicians. We have the numbers if we were to organize our communities and demand the kind of services that we should be expecting. Do you know what is the participation in a primary in Hartford?
7%.
7%. And at one point it was as high as 11%. Wow. And we are talking about complaining? No. This is the kind of colonial mentality that we have to get rid of. We should demand our rights, and this is why this subject is so important. It's from civil rights to human rights, because what we're talking about is not a civil right, it's a human right. So my answer is we need to demand more from government, more investment, but at the same time, let's not try to avoid the unavoidable. If you ask a private developer, if you ask a nonprofit developer, if you ask anyone from government in terms of the cost to build affordable housing, it is an impossibility. What I mean is that if it's not subsidized, you cannot make a profit.
So, yes, just picking up on that, it is very, there are not a lot of resources out there to build affordable housing. I tell everyone, and again, no disrespect to HUD, because HUD is a friend, they've worked well with our agency overall, but HUD is limited in terms of the resources that they can bring to the table. So this gets at the question that you're asking. It's incumbent upon institutions like the Hartford Housing Authority and other public institutions to see how they can work to create affordable housing opportunities separate and apart from the old HUD model. Because that old model is going to be limited. They're only going to give you a certain amount of operating subsidy a year. They're only going to give you a certain amount of capital funds a year. So during my earlier comments, I made reference to looking at my portfolio and repositioning it. Actually, I had a board meeting last night, a late board meeting last night. It's been a busy couple of days. And one of the things I put forward to my board of commissioners is a few initiatives that would help us reposition certain properties in our portfolio so that we're less reliant on the old HUD model, so that I can do more things, so that I can add more units at Mary Shepherd Place, the former Bellevue Square. And those units ultimately will be less reliant on HUD. And ultimately, they will attract, if the incentives are there, they will attract private investment. So one, trying to getting your question, we need the existing institutions like housing authorities, like cities or whatever, like the San Juan centers, to use those other resources that can be used to attract private capital. Now, on another point, in terms of the existing housing stock, we need to ensure that the inspections are done appropriately. Say what you will, but there are certain standards in terms of what inspections should be. There are private landlords, I know in the city of Hartford, that have gotten away with not doing certain things, but the funding has continued to come year after year after year, and they have literally failed these inspections without making, and they have not even tried to make appropriate improvements in the property. Again, I made reference to my existing portfolio of Section 8 vouchers. We have a process through which if a private landlord, if one of my residents comes to me and says, hey, I have this problem in my unit, and I automatically send out one of our inspectors to go and look at it, and the unit is not fixed, the conditions are not fixed within a certain amount of time, then the property goes into abatement. Abatement is simply means I ain't paying you no more. You're not getting any more money from me until it's fixed. So on two fronts, creating more, using additional resources to create more affordable housing stock, and then two, stricter inspection requirements.
Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Rana, you both are on the front lines of the failure of affordable housing in terms of providing enough units. And so for those
Thank you for the question. Just first I want to say, I didn't say thank you all for having us here. And thank you to Dr. Fiona Vernell for such a wonderful event. And also to Greg Dukas. I don't know where he just went, but he was here for a moment. But thank you all for having us. So the first thing I'll say is that we're not advocates, because what advocates do is they go to every meeting in the community and they help maybe 3-4 people and they call it a victory and they get a lot of grant money to do it. I'm not an advocate. I am a community organizer, and a community organizer lives by a certain set of principles, with one of them being the iron rule. Do y'all know what the golden rule is? What's the golden rule? Do unto others as you want them to do unto you. Hopefully everyone lives by that, right? But the iron rule is never, ever, 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 ever do for others what they can do for themselves. Never do for others what they can do for themselves. So an advocacy group wants to go and speak for someone. I don't go and speak for anyone. I give the tools to the people that are affected and the information and the knowledge and the resource to go out and fight for themselves. And that's the difference. So I don't have anything to offer in the terms of advocacy, because I don't know any of them. I have a church that, you know, they cook a few chicken dinners for you and clothe you, will love you, and would give you transportation. But on the other side of it, we are community organizers. So I'm not sure, what was the other part of your question?
Well, I asked about how to empower.
Yeah, I'll adjust it. I'll adjust it.
All right. So, personally, I'm gonna speak from personal experience, because I was, just 8 months ago, 9 months ago, I was one of those residents, desperate for a change in housing conditions, right? I wasn't one that wasn't housed, so I can't really speak on how that feels, you know. I don't wish that upon nobody. But just as a resident, to know your rights is crucial, right? And like the gentleman at the other end said, not just your civil rights, but your human rights, because as soon as you're born with rights that nobody can take from you. So the more you own up to your rights, the more you can navigate to what you deserve, or what you're entitled to. And then in a place like this here in America, you know, we are entitled to a lot just by default, just by being American citizens here. It's a lot of opportunity, it's a lot of resources, right? Now, I say that because it's positive, but at the same time, when we talk about resources, how do we go about allocating these resources? That is crucial, because you know, it may be that it's documented a certain way that it shows that these resources are going out to these communities that need it, but then when you really go try to pinpoint how much went where, it's some discrepancies going on, you know. So when we start thinking about it like that is, you know, for me, the best way to say, without sounding like I'm advocate, because I don't really know about advocacy, is just, you know, we need to try to come up with ways to better allocate resources with the people who really need them, right? Because we've heard of a couple of situations where not only residents abuse the system, but also landlords and private owners, they abuse the system, like just, you know, they get tax abatements that money then cuts down money that can be used for other things, like, you know. So for instance, if we was to try to do some math and pinpoint how many landlords and slumlords get tax abatements, and then we was to try to take that back with some sort of equity attached with that, and then try to push it back out to the people that need it, I'm pretty sure we can house a lot of those 700, 7,000, you know? So that's another conversation to have, but it's just, I want to put that in people's mind. It's not always that, you know, people need, it's just life happens. And when life happens, you know, you take some ups and downs, and, you know, we're always raised with that notion that here in America, when you're down, there are systems in place to pick you back up. And, you know, maybe it's time we start looking at those systems in place and better allocate resources in a proper way that the people that need it receive it. Cool, thank you.
And I just want to add a piece, just really quickly, about HUD, right? And I know everyone has different views about HUD, and I try to keep an open mind to everyone's view, but it's very, very hard to, you know, HUD has done a lot of great things when it comes to our elders and things like that, but I think HUD has completely failed on public housing, and just how they go about neighborhoods. I've never seen, I'm from Northeast Hartford, right? And I've never seen, so I would wonder why in the summertime, everybody would be outside their house because everyone was stuck in public housing. That was deplorable, right? And doing this work, I realized that HUD has participated in a level of segregation that we've never seen before. I mean, the only places in Connecticut that you can really, really, truly get public housing and affordable housing is Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury, and Hartford. And they're the most segregated spaces in the state. I mean, when you have so many public housing units in one space, what do you think is going to happen? And why is it that we're okay funding? That's why I appreciate what Ms. Anderson said. We have to look at that inspection process because it is ridiculous that when inspectors go in, they inspect at the minimum standard. Do you know what the minimum standard is? That's less than a one-star hotel. That's just making sure that you might have a doorknob or a knob on your stove. So we really have to look at that process and look at HUD and challenge these tools because they're allowing people to live in conditions and to continue to run itself as an organization. It's astonishing to me how they can continue to kind of do this in communities.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on a key word that you just used in terms of segregation, in terms of where the public housing units are focused in just in the state of Connecticut. Pastor Johnson is right. You know, the four major cities have the bulk of the housing. Anybody ever heard of the term NIMBY? N-I-M-B-Y? Not in my backyard. Not in my backyard. So why aren't the surrounding communities, whether it be Avon or Simsbury or Glastonbury or Westport or Mansfield or Stores, why aren't they doing more affordable housing? Most of these towns have housing authorities as well. You know, why isn't there more of a focus, a directive from various public officials that have the power to do this, whether it be HUD, whether it be state government, whether it be whatever, to have certain, I hate to use the term mandates or requirements, but maybe incentives to create affordable housing opportunities in the surrounding communities. So that if I'm a person who lives, you know, let's say if I lived in Clay Arsenal and I wanted to move to Simsbury, you know, and I wanted to find public housing, an affordable unit in Simsbury, you know how hard it would be for me to find that? You know how hard it would be for me to find an affordable housing unit in Simsbury or Avon? And then you layer on top of that, you know, the other things that a person has to deal with in terms of, you know, where your children are going to go to school, how they're going to be treated when they go to school. Come on. You know, how you're going to be treated when you walk through the supermarket. You know, I'm going to get personal here. My in-laws, African Americans, live in Berlin, Connecticut. You know, and my husband grew up in Berlin, Connecticut, African American, and you know, he faced discrimination growing up. You know, and so we have to ask ourselves, one, why have the surrounding communities, one, creating an atmosphere where people are more welcome across the board, whether it be housing, whether it be jobs, whether it be social interaction, whether it be education. It shouldn't just fall on the major cities.
Correct.
People should be able to take these vouchers, because again, a voucher is portable. And the term portable means you can take it anywhere, right? I'm sorry, I don't mean to steal this.
Preach on.
I'm preaching. I'm preaching. You can, voucher, you know, and in a perfect world, and go anywhere you want to. But the fact of the matter is, people have a hard time, even with a voucher that you can use anywhere in the United States, Puerto Rico, you know, Alaska, Hawaii. People have a hard time finding units in the surrounding communities. That's all I have to say.
I'm going to do one last round of questions that I had, and then I will turn to the audience questions. Between 2008 until this very moment, communities in North Hartford and in the south end of Hartford as well, especially among the Puerto Rican and African American and West Indian communities, had their neighborhoods became hotspots for both foreclosures and evictions, and I wondered if all of you could reflect on what this means in terms of actual access when some of the very spaces where these communities live are also the very site of foreclosures and evictions.
The San Juan Center is the only Latino led organization, non-profit organization, social service organization in the North End. And when we were established, we were organized around 1957 and incorporated as a non-profit organization in 1972. So in that period, particularly recently, talking about what your question is, we saw from Puerto Rico alone, the recession has lasted from 2005 until the present. It's so bad that the federal government intervened, declaring that Puerto Rico's debt was not payable. So that saw in the last decade alone, more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans leaving the island. So on top of that, in 2017, we saw the disaster of hurricanes Irma and Maria. So we directly received the influx of Puerto Rican coming here, and they did not have adequate housing. So what we did was we joined forces with the Hispanic Federation. We fundraised more than $24 million. We distributed aid in the 78 municipalities in Puerto Rico. However, I go back to the same subject. We can talk about statistics. We can tell you that in Hartford, of all the 100% of units, only 25% are occupied by the owners. And I can keep going on and on and on. The poverty rate in the Puerto Rican community is much lower than any other state in the United States. So again, if you look at the statistics, you can identify the problem. For me, the issue is how to resolve it. And going back to HUD and many other systems, we should start talking about a restructure of how the wealth is distributed in this country. For instance, in Connecticut alone, you have the phenomenon that 2 years ago when General Electric was still here, making billions of dollars of revenue, not total outcomes or total sales, income, gains, profits, they were paying a relative 0% actual tax. There are students here that pay more taxes than General Electric.
Yeah.
And you have Amazon. So when people mention, well, what about HUD? They have done all this good. Well, the issue is that in this administration, the last two budgets have recommended a cut in HUD. So if you have the demand going up and you have the supply in terms of how to respond going down, there's a problem. And guess who pays ultimately the consequences?
Yeah.
We do. You name it, whether you have to increase the police department, the fire department, and you name it. So for me, the response have to do with organizing, yes, advocating, that's what we do. Advocating in your face, mobilizing people. And from that core of organizers and advocates, we can mobilize the muscle, the political muscle, to change these laws that keeps us, again, like in this spinning wheel.
I'll just comment briefly with regard to foreclosures, and I did notice that the exhibit outside with regard to the highlight on foreclosures and evictions. I think part of it, quite honestly, is I think that people that have been underserved don't necessarily have the resources, and when I say resources, I'm talking about more than financial resources. I'm talking about just the knowledge, because there's a disconnect between what's out there in terms of helping people hold on to their homes, the knowledge that it takes for people to hold on to their homes, and regarding different programs and the people. I know that there are programs out there that will help people hold on to their homes so they won't be foreclosed on and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a disconnect between the people and that knowledge. And so whether it be the community organizers, I think there needs to be a connection made so that people know what their rights are, that will help them during the foreclosure process or the eviction process. I will tell you, as a owner of units, one of the hardest things that, one of the things I hate to do is to have to put someone in the system for eviction. There are times when people can't pay their rent. I will tell you, our organization, we work with people. We do things like stipulated agreements where people agree to pay back and so on and so forth. There are times, I will admit, where it's just not a good fit. Someone's just not, we're going to be more adamant about removing someone from a particular unit that is disrupting the quality of life for others. In my mind, rent is something we can work on. But if you're a disruption to the overall community, if you're just not working well with the other residents there, then I think that's when, my organization, I know that's when we move towards eviction. But yes, there is a definitely a higher percentage. Because I think it's just because of the disconnect and people not aware what their rights are.
So my answer to that question would be, because I graduated in 2008, and when I came back home to Hartford, it was a very, very different place. And I would go backwards and express my story of how when my parents moved to Connecticut from Bronx, New York, we moved to Rocky Hill, and we were one of the first black families to move in Rocky Hill, and we weren't welcome there, and it ended up in an eviction, and it ended up, my father was a pastor, and it ended up, he did not want to live with one of the people that he was serving in our congregation, so we ended up living in our cars. And that, I didn't know I was black until I moved to Rocky Hill, Connecticut, one. And two, I didn't know that even if you're educated, both my parents are doctors, even if you're educated and you're of a different color in those spaces, they still don't want you there, no matter how much education you have. So I learned that that segregation was actually real. And we moved where we were supposed to move with black people during that time. But when I came back in 2008, I never really knew, because a lot of my friends lived in the spaces that I'm now organizing, and I always assumed that they own their home. And when I came back to Connecticut after college in 2008, 2009, I realized that none of my parents owned their homes, that it was a rental investment for people who don't live in Hartford, that are typically from New York, or out-of-town landlords that own their property. And when the financial problems happen, a lot of my friends' moms, grandmothers got booted out those houses because, one, they didn't own it, and two, whoever owned it, it was better to let it go than to keep it. And so now, from 2008 to 2019, where we are now, I have a bunch of dilapidated properties around where I grew up and around where I live because of that financial crisis that happened. And I think that really hurt Hartford, but that's not the first time we've seen something like that. We've seen properties happen like this back in, and they would know better than I would know, but back in 1967, 1968, when white flight happened in the north end of Hartford. I was with a guy yesterday at a Yard Goats baseball game, and it's always funny to hear like white people come up to me and say, hey, yeah, I went to Weaver High School. And back during that time, back in the 60s and the early 50s, it the north end of Hartford was primarily Jewish. And when you hear someone says, oh, well, I went to Weave, I was like, well, why did you leave? And then my mind just flashes back to the riots when Dr. King died and how people really didn't want to live in spaces where black or people of color lived anyway. So they began to migrate to the suburbs, West Hartford, Newington, Berlin, in these spaces. So what we saw in 2008 is only still a reflection of what truly happened to me in the 1960s when white flight happened. I mean, the north end of Hartford has been destabilized ever since then. And in 2008, we only saw the lack of investment in what people really thought when when they had to make a financial decision, they offloaded these properties and let's just let the bank take it. And now I have blight in my neighborhood, I have broken buildings, I have collapsing buildings, and no one takes account for it. And so I think that kind of destruction happened well before 2008, but it happened in the 1960s.
Just to pick up a little bit where Pastor AJ was going, I want to go a little further back real quick just to put something into perspective. Majority of the north end of Hartford, it's redlining, meaning it is high risk to come invest, it is high risk to get a mortgage loan, it is high risk, period. So when we start thinking about the deterioration and of buildings around and how they couldn't keep up mortgages, that is something to keep in mind. If this was a different town and, just across the town from Hartford, you probably would have had that safety net to go to a bank and try to get a mortgage outright. But through the redlining, a lot of these properties are deemed at high risk. So it's nearly impossible to have developers come develop this, developers come build houses, or just simply have deals with banks to try to help you through your financial crisis, right? So it's just, I don't want to take too much time, I just wanted to bring up that point because that is crucial, and just real quick, just in 1940, they had it was in a docket that people of color couldn't even have, not even a house in West Hartford, unless you were a servant, it is an actual court document. So when we start to talk about things like that, and still has the name Hartford in it, just on the west side, So I just wanted to put that out there into perspective that, yes, sometimes it is because the financial crisis happened. Some people may say, since 2008, taxes been going up crazy here in Connecticut, even big name corporations have left, so it's a lot that play out, but I just wanted to bring out how redlining is still affecting communities like my own and communities here in Hartford, and I believe that we can't talk about one without talking about the other. Thank you.
Thank you. There are several questions from the audience cards asking the panelists if you could talk about the relationship between housing and education.
I'll say simple. If a child doesn't have a decent place to live, how can they learn?
That's right.
Housing is a foundation for a lot of things, whether it be education, whether it be jobs. When you go to fill out an application for a job, what is one of the things that they ask you? Your address, right? If a child doesn't have a decent, safe and affordable place to live, how can they study? How can a child study and learn if they have to worry about being bitten by rats? When they go to sleep at night. So there's a definite connection. Housing is a basic foundation. Housing should be a fundamental right. Let me say that clearly. A fundamental right in this country. Because without housing, there are a lot of other things that will, the lack of that housing will be an impediment to other things.
But that is the obvious link between higher education and better housing conditions. However, 189 districts in Connecticut. Connecticut is almost the size, almost identical size of Puerto Rico. This is a very small state. And you have 189 different municipal, well, it's 169, but you got the districts, I used to study this. No, the issue is How many urban cities are in the top echelons of educational performance? None. So the inequity, it is very easy for me to say, oh yes, there's a link between education and better housing. Of course, we discover America. The issue is how you transform, so at least you have a system that is more county-wise. You divide the resources, and then you don't have individuals performing in substandard schools, in segregated schools, and then, even if they're not performing, they cannot even go into the lottery to go to a magnet school, either in Hartford or outside in the suburbs.
Regionalization, right?
Of course, regionalization is not only the system that adequately respond. Obviously, you have a central government that have to allocate better resources. But if you have a silo in Greenwich and another silo in Avon, they're not going to say, oh, let's send money to Hartford or to New Haven, because that's not in their interest. They wake up every morning, they look at their kids and say, okay, let's go to this school because that's what I want for my kids. And if you were living in Greenwich or Avon, you would be doing the same thing. The issue is, why don't we have the same opportunities? They keep talking in government and politicians about opportunities, equal rights, and that. But in the reality, that's not what happened. We have to change the system so you can start changing people's lives so they can transform from the lower income to middle class and or high income. I mean, it's the same.
What's up, Jasmine? It's my homie from Hartford Public Library. So yeah, I don't really know what to say about this, because again, I go to sleep and I wake up with this, you know, you can't be so close to trauma and not feel it and internalize it, because it's actually, we're not talking about something that's happening in 1940. We're talking about something that's like happening today, where school just let out 2 hours ago, with children who, because they live in a certain neighborhood, you know, and because they don't get a lottery, don't get an opportunity to have a fair education like the towns around them. And it's hurtful to see, because in one of the buildings that I was organizing, a mom told me that, you know, my son cannot go to school and learn properly if mice are tap dancing on his bed at night. Like, it is no way my son can go to school and get a decent education. Only to go across the street to the school and get some of the worst education that this child is ever going to get, compared with, in comparing that school to white suburban towns next door. Do you like understand how messed up that is? That we are comparing grade levels in education to towns with one high school, one middle school, one elementary school that is funded fairly and have all the tools and all the books that they need, right? And then saying that this is the mark of education, and there's something always wrong with Hartford kids because they don't seem to make the mark. When the textbooks that they get are still from 1985 and 1986, in 2019. And then people say, well, Hartford gets more funding for students and teachers, you know, in their school system than any other town.
That's not true.
You know, then you hear arguments like that, and it's just like, well, we have teachers that come from Teach of America, white teachers, who come into a cultural context in which they don't understand, and then we ask them to teach and be effective, but in 2 years, they're gone to a suburban town because now their student loans are paid off, and we have no investment in our neighborhood, and we ask what the problem is. So, you know, this stuff really, really hits home to me, because a lot of the parents that I organize in these buildings have no choice but to send their kids there. And that's why I started something called Calling Our Brothers, where it went viral like across the country, where men come together and greet children back in their community schools. Hundreds of men dressed that from different professions come and greet kids only in community schools. And people call me prejudiced, people call me a lot of different things, and it's okay, but you can't judge me for wanting to make sure the children in my neighborhood that don't get a fair shake get an opportunity to be greeted by men of color in their own community that's working just so they can see and identify something that they may have never seen before. And so I just think it's messed up, and there is a gap between housing and education. And when I got into housing, I'll say this and I'll be quiet. When I got into housing, I never really wanted to get into it because it's just too big. I thought it was a problem, so I never touched it because that is just a huge problem. But meeting various different residents who we call the low-income people, we have various names for these people that people write in grants that make it flashy so they can get grant money, right? These folks deal with some of the hardest things you'll ever have to deal with. Not only trying to figure out how to provide for themselves, but have trust in an education system that's been flat funded for over a few decades. And what that means is you get places with no books. You get places that don't have, because we're only committed to spending this much amount of money to make sure you get it. The final thing I'll say, I was talking to a principal who I love so much, who's over in my son's daycare. And she was leaving her community school in a meeting that we organized with the parents and superintendent. She said the bravest thing that I've ever heard a black woman say to power. This school system is asking me to fly a plane called education, called Milner School. And I get, while flying the plane, you take the steering wheel. While flying the plane, you take the wheels. While flying the plane, you take the wings. While flying the plane, you take the black box. So if something happens, nobody know what happened. And you're asking me to land this plane with nothing. That's how it's like being a principal in Hartford Public Schools.
Well, it's hard to follow that statement. It's all right. So, I know, it's not but passion and love. So I'll be brief. Just want to point it at a different direction, right? You heard Pastor AG talk about Milner. Christian Activities Council put up a fight to try to save Milner, but some compromise happened. So it went from K through 6 to what is it now? About 5 and 6.
Yeah, K through
5 and 6. So now it's going to be a middle school, and they came up with this decision disregarding how it'll affect communities, disregarding, and again, it's going to connect to housing, because when you're in subsidized housing, it's paid by the federal department, but it's only paid for that place. It's not like Ms. Anderson explained about a voucher, which is portable. So here we are diminishing a community school that community members attend and take their kids to, without thinking of how would that affect them, without thinking, do they have the transportation or the funds for transportation or the resource to transport their kids from this community now to wherever they deem their kids need to go next, right? And I say that to also bring up a light that Christian Activities Council also helped, that was Martin Luther King? Yeah. All right, cool, definitely. So we also helped Martin Luther King School with a similar situation. They just announced that they were going to close it and that kids will have to go and study at another basement of some sort. And it brought back a lot of horrendous memories, right? Way back in the day, we know who ended up in basements and the type of education they got, right? We don't need to go backwards, but just you imagine telling people of color, mothers of color, that your kids, that their mothers and their grandparents lived this, that your kids will be put in a basement while we figure out where they go next. And shout out to the parents that stood united, and shout out to the Christian Activities Council who helped, navigate through the obstacles with these parents and held it open long enough for them to come up with a decent plan that the parents didn't ultimately agree with, but it was decent enough to compromise with, right? And again, it goes back to the lack of care for these communities. community schools mean a lot. Not only, you know, I went to Milner, K through 6. I didn't graduate there. I graduated at McDonald in the South End, but I know what the importance that Milner had to the community, right? The parents who take their kids there that graduated from this school knows the impact that it has to the community. But, you know, in my opinion, what's going on in today's day and age is almost like we will do anything to save a buck today, regardless the outcome that'll bring tomorrow. You know, and that is deep because it is the same as in housing as it is with our school educations right now. When you think about community schools, right, I am still trying to grasp why we can't bring a community school driven enough to compete with these so-called magnet schools that they bring into these same places, right? And then, again, my opinion is, when I see this, it's like you bring in a magnet school to this community, so by default, I'm like, okay, we got better opportunity in this community, and they're like, no, it's a Claude now, you gotta qualify for this, whatever that means, and you know, we have to give a certain amount of seats for outside students to come in first and try to fill these seats. And you know, the more we start trying to analyze why is the need for this, you know, quick thing they try to say is, you know, we ain't have enough tax revenue to bring this, or it's always something about taxes, but last time I checked, Connecticut keep raising taxes, so how can we keep using the fact we ain't got no tax money to fund stuff when taxes keep going up? You know, so I wanted just to put that in you guys' ears real quick because, you know, if we was to sit back and actually try to analyze what is going on, it will not match to what is being said to us and the reasons of the powers that be making these decisions. Thank you.
Fiona, just
I knew
paraphrasing.
you were gonna touch on Chef versus O'Neill. Please do.
Yes.
Yeah, I was about to tell you. Go ahead. Go for it.
Well, paraphrasing Martin Luther King, I mean, when you see injustice anywhere, it's injustice everywhere. Now, the reason I'm making that comment is because we should not, in this panel, we're looking at through the prism of racism, discrimination, ethnical, discrimination, etc. We should not forget that there are communities, white communities, impoverished communities, in the same circumstances that we're describing. And the decision of Chef Bermudez versus O'Neill, not Chef versus O'Neill, Chef Bermudez versus O'Neill. Yeah. That decision, the Supreme Court of Connecticut said that it's not the racial isolationism, but it's the economic isolationism. So we need to work towards bring the same individuals, they're also human beings, and they deserve the same quality education like anywhere else.
I am very well aware of the time. I'm very concerned about the time, and I don't want to separate you from your refreshments any further. Part of the reason why we gave out cards is because we are going to be transitioning the exhibition into a website, and we're going to host the panel discussion, the recorded panel discussion on that website so that we can continue this conversation. We're also going to be taking this exhibition to Hartford, and we're going to continue to build out this exhibition. I have so many questions from the audience with these cards, but it is a little after 6:15, and so I do want to wrap up and thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much, Mr. Bencourt. Thank you so much, Ms. Sanderson. Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson. Thank you so much, Mr. Serrano. I think that this discussion is just the tip of the iceberg, and we have had a really rich discussion around how deeply implicated housing is in all of these issues around poverty, around segregation, and around education. But I also think that one of the biggest takeaway is that we have a lot of the tools to also not just engage those who are at the top levels of power in engaging this systemic issue so that we feel overwhelmed and burdened as if we can't do anything. We also have our voice. We have our research. We can help to contribute to that knowledge that people are lacking about how they can save their homes or how they can access housing. install this exhibit, and thank you to Rachel, who was outside when I was introducing all of the students. Rachel, I'm sorry to embarrass